So welcome to another Nantucket program. This one is the basics of grant writing. My name is Daniel Griffin. So I have about 8+ years experience in the development sector, specifically grant writing. I do hold a certificate of grant writing from San Diego State University. I was previously the director of grants for Lyon College in Arkansas. I am to the island by way of the Nantucket Atheneum. I work in all 3 departments there: circulation, programs, and development. And tonight we're going to talk pretty much the basics about grant writing. But I'm going to treat this session as, from the novice approach, I'm going to make it very comprehensive. If you've come to us and you have some background in grant writing and some of this feels a little, you've already covered it before, just stay patient with us and we'll try to get to all the topics that you find relevant. We're about to begin. I do remind you to go ahead and mute yourselves unless you're asking a question. And if you got a question, please don't hesitate. Just jump right in there, interrupt me, and we'll get it answered for you. And the PowerPoint itself, I am going to take up the whole hour. It is a bit text intensive, but we'll get through that. I really just want to make sure all the concepts are there and you feel comfortable leaving this course. So with that, we will, just a second, it should have been up and ready for us. Excuse me, my computer glitched. We have this in today's COVID, no worries. Get that brought up real quick. Dead time is bad time. Okay, we're rolling. Here we go. All right. So the basics of grant writing, I do want to take this point in time at the beginning just to give credit to the source material. It's a book called Getting Funded, The Complete Guide to Writing Grant Proposals, and that's by Mary Hall and Susan Hallett. That book, and that's the 4th edition, that book in particular was my Bible when I first started doing grants. I do recommend it. It covers anything and everything you could hope to learn about grant writing and really building your skills. Again, that's Getting Funded, The Complete Guide to Writing Grant Proposals. I highly recommend that book. But with that, let's get started. So we're going to start with the ideas of planning a proposal. And this is going to be broken down into 2 essential phases. And that's what we're going to cover tonight. Phase 1, the planning steps, and phase 2, writing that proposal. And within that phase 1, we're going to identify major characteristics, assess your capabilities, and refine project ideas, and select funding sources and research. And then we'll transition into phase 2, that writing the proposal, the identifying the needed content, the gather and compose remaining elements of the proposal, and that checklist that really helps us make sure we did our due diligence. So within that phase 1, we see our boxes here, and we go into, it just gives you a bit of a sequential order into the appropriate steps you would take in that process with identifying, assessing, refining, and selecting that funding source. And so we're going to get into the identifying major characteristics of the project idea. And so you really want to start off in the beginning, making sure that you're approaching your proposal in the right way by building a profile for the project. And so, and you want to decide what type of grant you will be seeking. And then we're going to get into what we call solicited or unsolicited. These are important terms to keep in mind, and we'll break that down. Solicited versus unsolicited is a very important concept that, in my experience, can sometimes be left out, unfortunately. And so when we talk about building a profile for our project, one of the most common ways to begin that planning a proposal is to identify those basic characteristics of the type of project we are seeking to fund. So what do we mean by that? What is the function of the project we are proposing? Is our project unique? Which is really important. Funders do not like duplicated efforts. What field is our project? So is it health? Is it community development? What need are you going to be targeting within the community? Who will benefit from your project? So what specific demographic, for example, at-risk youth? What are the geographical parameters of your project? A lot of, especially when you talk about your private foundations, they're going to have a specific geographic, for the most part, geographic focus that they're going to want to award their funding to. And so you will need to make sure that that geographic focus aligns with said funding resource. And you see there at the bottom, clearly identifying as many of the appropriate descriptive characteristics of a proposed project, not only guide our research for funding sources, but it will also help us identify others doing related work, which could help in terms of partnerships and sources of data to support the need that will come to define our project. And so decide what type of grant we will likely be seeking. So this is important too, when really taking those first steps in how you're going to approach that proposal. So the project or the program grant, you can have an operating grant, a startup award, a challenge grant, a capital award, endowment grant. These terms are new to you. Don't get overwhelmed. A basic Google search will give you all the details that you'll need for that. The internet, 20 years ago, you really had to do some hard research. Well, just through books, and accessing the information was a little bit more difficult than what it is today with the advent of technology. And so anytime you come across these specific terms, don't get overwhelmed. Google and the internet will take care of you. And we'll talk about some resources that you can utilize whenever researching grants and funding sources. And so coming back to those two terms I talked about, solicited versus unsolicited. So it's crucial. It's crucial to know whether our proposal is for a project idea that originated primarily with us, or our submitting agents, the submitting agency, are with the purpose identified by the funding resource. So that would be solicited. And so when we talk about unsolicited, think of it more of us approaching, so in hypothetical, a foundation who has not sent us an RFP. So we are soliciting their services, whereas an RFP, a request for proposal, would be solicited. So why are these terms important in the beginning of our process? Unsolicited proposals, so proposals that we're developing off a need that we've established, are going to be really tailored to a project defined by our ideas, our organization, our respective organization, our ideas. When you start going towards a solicited award, you're going to have to start shifting your project idea to match that funding resource's interest. And so you want to identify, if you're going to go solicited or unsolicited in the beginning, how much are you willing to compromise in your initial project idea concept to meet the interest of said funding source. And we'll get into the different avenues and processes that, depending on the left or right that you decide to choose, what that means for you. So types of solicited projects, as I just said. So you have basic term, RFP, request for proposal, describes the type of program to be mounted, the outcomes intended, and the criteria to be used in selecting the recipients of the fund, and then program announcements. That's more your federal. A lot of times you'll see what's called an FOA, so a funding opportunity announcement. Again, they're interchangeable, RFP, FOA. It just, a lot of times, it just kind of denotes what sector it's coming from, private, federal, state, that sort of thing. And the more you dive into it, the more you learn about why certain entities use different acronyms. And so just to reiterate the importance of solicited versus unsolicited there, I do want to highlight that last bullet. Do not waste your time or that of the funder with inappropriate application. And so what I mean by that is solicited proposals can be more difficult to be awarded. And so if you haven't done the proper research, the proper stewardship with said foundation, I'm going to continue to use a private foundation as our hypothetical example here, you really stand a high probability of not being awarded. Them just getting a cold solicitation, LOI, or not an LOI, but just proposal without prior contact, it's going to be hard to get that awarded. And so you really want to make sure you reach out to that funder and you do your research in prior contact before you waste your time developing that proposal. A lot of that process is going to involve letters of inquiries. You'll see sometimes you just call. There's no real playbook. It's really depends on the resource that you're targeting. And so from there, we'll go into assessing our capabilities. And so as the author of the cited resource material, preparation submission of the proposal is benefit to us, even if the first attempt doesn't get funded. And what she's saying there, proposals can be looked as a self-auditing process. You can really find your strengths and weaknesses within a program that you are wishing to be subsidized through a grant, through the proposal process. I really recommend it. It can be very beneficial. So if all that to say, if you don't get funded, it's not the end of the world. There are other indirect benefits. And so questions asked, should you write these proposals? Proposals for purposes that do not tie to the mission are better left unwritten. Now that is specifically your mission. So a funder doesn't want to award a proposal that seems to be extramural to the mission or the need that you're providing within your community. They really want to see a tie there. And to go even further, you're going to want that proposal to match up with their mission as well. Your mission and their mission, more often than not, should overlap in some way. There's one type of proposal that the author of the resource material does claim that you should always think twice about writing, and that is for starting a new organization. I wouldn't go absolute in that comment. Seed funding can be hard to get through a grant. It's not impossible. There are grant opportunities specifically for seed funding. You just need to do your due diligence and be careful that the organization has awarded a seed grant in the past. And I'll talk to you about resources that you can look into to where you can do your research and see if they've done that before. And so again, assessing whether you should respond to an RFP, I'm going to fly through this a little bit. Is the purpose of the proposal consistent? Does your organization have a strategic plan that's important, that positions us, when I use the first person here, I'm referring to me and you, the audience, to achieve excellence? Do we understand and can we explain the competitive advantage of our agency for this particular proposal? Do we know who else in the community or field is doing similar work? And so what we talk about there is duplication of efforts. That can be a big no-go in the grant and development nonprofit sector. Duplicated efforts are frowned upon, and we can articulate what makes us work distinct from others. So that's that burden of proof you'll find within the proposal. Do we have or can we get the right staff for this project? So that's going to go into do you have the appropriate capacity to carry out the proposed program? Do we have the appropriate infrastructure to support the project and ensure that we can spend the funds within the required time frame? Believe it or not, I have managed programs that were funded through grants that said program was not spending the allocated funds in time. That can be just as bad or worse than spending the funds too quickly or inappropriately. You can be red flagged for that as well. The funder does not like to get their money back. So you really need to be due diligent, and when you're developing that budget, realistic in what your capacity and capabilities are. So we move into our next step within the essential planning steps, and that's developing the idea. So assessing the need. The need is so important. The need is essentially your burden of proof. What are you going to do with their money? And so the thing that I counsel people on the most is when writing your proposal and you're writing your need statement, never frame that need statement in terms of the need of your organization. That need should always be in the voice/perspective of those you are seeking to benefit. So your target demographic within your community. If you're writing a proposal to target at-risk youth, you should be speaking to and about at-risk youth within your need statement. Don't reference yourself as the organization. Don't, we need the money to. These particular at-risk youth need the money for, that sort of thing. And some external considerations, the nature of the need, the relevance of the project, duplication of efforts as we spoke to, internal considerations, and from there our prioritization, the applicant resources, and impact on the applicant. And so I know I'm moving fast through this. We do have a lot to cover. Again, don't hesitate to ask any questions, but assessing that need, really defining that need is very important. It can be everything within your proposal. If your need's not there for the funder, if it doesn't really jerk at that funder, the proposal is going to have a hard time standing up through that application process. So defining the approach. So once our need is defined, the next step is refining the project idea to consider many alternative methods for responding. And so from there, analyze the merits and the disadvantages of each. And so I have some questions here for you and what that would entail. So what has been the experience of other organizations or individuals in launching similar projects? Who else in the region or in the field is doing this type of work? Do your research there. Don't waste your time. And what has been learned from their experiences? Reach out. This is a good way to form relationships. Does our approach fit the priorities and preferences of the potential funder? We spoke to this. This is very important in terms of your due diligence. And coming down at the bottom there, building support and involvement. Your stakeholders, both internal and external, should be included in developing the project idea. So that's where we talk about the program assessment, the program evaluation, the monitoring evaluation, stakeholder involvement. This is a very big concept when it comes to international development. Stakeholder involvement should always be involved in your process within your proposal development. Don't ever underestimate their importance. And so documenting that need, again, we keep coming back to that need. We talk about data allows the proposal to show instead of tell. Listen, we've been hearing this since we were in grade school when it comes to writing, show versus tell. Data is tangible. Data reflects the true need within the community. It's not enough to tell your prospective funder that you have at-risk youth within your community that needs X, Y, and Z. You need the data, the statistics to back that up. And again, in the advent of technology, we had those resources more prevalent to us than ever before. So we kind of speak to that. So data helps us prove the need for the project, spoke to that, document the degree to which our organization has previously been successful. So that speaks to the idea of showing your validity to carry out the project. So that's something important to keep in mind as well. And so now we move into selecting that funding source. Selecting the funding source can be a lot of the process. And so finding that common ground, so this is pretty text heavy, I'll guide you through this. So to convince that funder that your project is worth considering, we must explain why we believe there's a compelling connection between our goals and theirs. And so that's what I was talking about, making sure there's a tie between your mission and theirs, why funding our proposal idea is an opportunity they wouldn't want to miss on. So really show them why you are the ones who will fulfill that need that they set up their foundation for in the first place. So shared mission, shared constituency, shared culture, shared image, shared market, damage control, all these things are important in really finding that common ground. Don't waste your time with a funder who has a track record of giving a lot of money through grants, but in terms of overlap with common shared mission, constituency, and culture, you're just really lacking. Don't waste your time there, because your probability is going to be slim. So understanding the types of funders. So public funders, basic here, federal government, state and local government. A lot of people refer to the federal government when they talk about grants. I'm one that I prefer the private sector. I feel there's a little bit more creative control within the private sector, but federal is a very good resource. They're a little bit more time intensive, and you have to really manage that ratio of return on investment when it comes to grants. And so understanding private funders. So again, we talk about foundations, carry out purposes established by their founders, who are trustees and generally support efforts in specific fields, issue areas, and the community. And so, again, just some basic concepts we've already referred to: general support, operation funds. So general support, operation funds. So when we talk about unsolicited operating funds are hard to get through grants. Now, we've had programs on the Atheneum where I've had an individual talk about, given COVID, foundations are coming back to this, given the needs of nonprofits right now, and giving can kind of go down with the downturn of the economy. And so it's a ratio thing. The common phrase within grants is it depends. And so those type of funds can be hard to get through grant writing, but they're there. And if you do your homework, you can find it. So capital building, program related investments, seed money, all that sort of thing there. We come back into private funders. You can have your corporate foundation, corporate giving program, employee gift matching. We see that a lot. Places that we work, you might work in an organization that will match a gift that you make to a nonprofit. Contribution in kind is also common. Giving groups, service organizations, special interest groups. Special interest groups are going to be more of your, what you call a 501c4. Those are more of your advocacy groups. They're a little bit different than your 501c3. You're more of your nonprofit corporation and that sort of thing. And then we come into, so identifying and locating funders. And so there are online resources. You can have print directories. I really don't use print directories. It's a little bit antiquated these days with so many online resources. Local libraries are still beneficial if you're looking for local resources. They can be beneficial there. Your own constituents, so word of mouth, elected officials can be a good resource. Partnerships, similar organizations, you never know. Prior funders, vendors, those type of resources. So I really wanted to show you this. There's a company called Candid. Candid just bought what's called the Foundation Center. The Foundation Center when you go onto their website, is a massive resource. They do all kinds of things. They have all kinds of resources for grant writing best practices, from how-to tutorials, toolkits, anything and everything. And what really I've always used as their primary resource, it's what's called the Foundation Directory Online. And that is essentially a database of grantors. And what we mean by grantors, federal agencies, private foundations that give through grant making. And so you can access this free. It's going to be very limited free. You're only really going to be able to access the organization's profile in their 990. If you go ahead and buy into a subscription, you can really get some next level depth in terms of analytics, who they've awarded in the past. They have already done the work for you in terms of what they will and will not award. They usually have a breakdown of board members, trustees, people of interest, contacts, people who work at the organization. They've introduced new graphic features in terms of what they call pathways. They've given to an organization that's sort of in your field that flows directly into you. So a follow the money approach. Now, Candid recently bought GuideStar. Think of GuideStar as the LinkedIn for nonprofits. Again, you can use GuideStar for free. It's very limited, but you can do a search. You will find organizations for grantees and grantors. So you're going to get everybody. And what you're going to get with that the free version is basically just a basic profile information and access to their 990, which is useful. I use 990s a lot in terms of just kind of researching what the organization, or who I should say the organization has funded in the past. And that's for grantors. With GuideStar, you got to kind of watch whether or not you're clicking on a grantee. It's kind of going to be counterproductive to your efforts. Foundation Search is another fee for service, Grant Station, Grant Select, Grantsmanship Center. Couple of these might be a little outdated. They should all still be around. If you go out looking for one of these and they're not there anymore, I apologize, but they should still be around. Like anything else, they get bought up real quick and sometimes they just disappear. Like Candid did. Foundation Center used to be its own thing. Candid's kind of bottlenecking the industry there. But Foundation Center and GuideStar are two fundamental resources. If you're trying to do a grant search, or a funding source search, and you don't have one of these resources, you're probably going to have a hard time. Doing basic Google searches is tough. These fee-for-service companies have really bottlenecked the industry. When you do a basic Google search, a lot of times Foundation Center is going to come up. So just a little FYI there. So again, researching identified funders, really look at their guidelines, their annual reports. We talked about their 990s. If you're not familiar with the 990, it's the essentially the taxes that nonprofits have to submit every year, just like we do with our personal taxes. And what this is going to break down is the organization, its financials, its public information, but a little trick of the trade, when you go to an organization's 990, scroll all the way to the bottom and then start working your way up. And that's where the grant section is for a grantor in terms of who they funded. Really look over their websites. I've spent countless of hours on websites. Everything's websites these days. Industry publications and individuals who know them. Again, those contacts. Listen, it's real no playbook. A lot of times it just can come down to calling and reaching out to people. You know, it's not what you know, it's who you know. So making contact with that funder, I won't spend too much time on this. It's pretty basic. Do your homework, approach them, make a good impression. That letter of inquiry we talk about, there's resources out there in terms of how to properly structure a letter of inquiry. Think of it like a cover letter you would for a job application, really tight. Try to keep it to 1 page. If you have to do 2 pages, I really wouldn't go beyond 2 pages for a letter of inquiry. Cultivate that stewardship, we talked about that. Never deviate from the rules. If you think it's semantics and yeah, but there are no yeah buts. Follow the rules. It's just like a job application. You will get thrown in the trash quick. Don't bother them soon after the deadline. It's a don't call me, I'll call you situation. Thank you notes. Again, it's a nice practice. There's a bit of a strategy to that as well. And as always, follow through with promises of acknowledgement and reporting. So that's going a little beyond what we're talking about now, that reporting. Basically, if you get awarded and there's reporting requirements, you better do it. If you don't, it can be a red flag and can really tarnish your representation as an organization who seeks to be funded. And so this, I'm going to fly through this. This is just an example of when I worked at a past organization and some of the research I did for said organization and what that can look like. So they were looking for like-minded organizations. This is an example. They were the philanthropic arm of a biopharmaceutical company, and they worked with orphan diseases. And so a federal agency that would have been of interest for said nonprofit I was working for would have been NIH, and that's National Institutes of Health. And we just kind of break down those. So in the federal, we call them FOA, funding opportunity announcements. Don't get bogged down with this. This is a whole world within itself. Parent RO3s and RO1. This takes hours. Don't get bogged down with that. It's just a real snapshot of what it could look like if you're targeting a federal agency. NIH is huge. It has its own database. Just be prepared to get some coffee and do some reading. Here we go into some private organizations. Lilly was an example of one that I presented them, kind of some of the stuff I would provide off Lilly. You know, Lilly provides grants and charitable contributions for healthcare professionals. Patient advocacy, this was key. This is what we were interested in, and so on. Another organization of interest, kind of in bold why they would have fit. And then again, just some other like-minded organizations, and breaking down why I would put them on the list to be considered for the project we were trying to do. Just some of the stuff that you would want to keep in mind when researching organizations. And so I'm going to go ahead and go through this, and we're going to get into phase 2, the writing and the submitting the proposal. And so this is some of the tricks of the trade. Again, I want to emphasize the most cliche comment in grant making is it depends. There's no true playbook, but there are best practices and parameters to keep in mind. In other words, the what not to do, things to guide you from that perspective. So like we've talked about, identify needed content, lay out the process, gather and compose remaining elements of the proposal, use a checklist to do a final review, submission notification, and renewal. And we'll dive into this now. So, reasons for writing a good proposal. I just wanted to highlight this. It allows to develop useful schedule for implementing the project. What people really take for granted in the proposal development process is how many other individuals it's going to take at your organization, information you're going to need for them, and aligning that schedule based off their work schedule and not coming to them 48 hours before deadline and saying you need such and such, in which they're not going to have time to turn around and give you, especially when we talk about that data in your analytics department. You're right, maybe it's your technical department at your organization, those responsible for your statistics and communications. You really want to be intentional with them in developing that schedule and really getting on the same timeline when you're developing that project. So we provide that framework. We talk about that for project management, force ourselves to make certain that adequate resources have been anticipated. So that's when we talk about our capacity to carry out the proposed project. And when we talk about capacity, it can be people, employees, it can be facilities, it can be space, it can be equipment that the proposal is not going to cover, that you're already going to need on hand to carry out the program. These are important things to account for. And the more you do the proposal process, the more you do program implementation, the better you get at accounting for such things, especially when developing that budget. Serve as a vehicle for informing others, test the degree of real internal commitment to the project. Listen, you really need buy-in from your organization, especially those that you're going to depend on to carry out that implementation or facilitation of the proposed project. If you don't have that buy-in and people just kind of eye roll it or brush it off or make it a very end of the list priority, there's going to be some frustration real quick when reporting based off an rewarded project is coming due. If you haven't been awarded yet and you're still in that application process, when you have deadlines, and again, different departments that you're depending on getting information from, if they're not on the same page on how important the grant is to the organization, can really jam you up in terms of those deadlines and can become a problem. Again, a proposal must prove we have knowledge in our field, so you are an authority in which you propose you are going to implement and engage the funder in our excitement about the project. You want to seem genuine and that you are on the same page as them in terms of passion. Major components of a proposal. And so we're going to get into the nitty-gritty here. And so, as I've said, there's no such thing as a proposal or proposal format suitable to every funding source. This is something you'll get better at as you continue the process of applying through the grant process. It really does depend on that funding source. Federal and private foundations, the federal requirements are above and beyond what you will find in the private sector. Private sectors, a lot of times, they're being read by, again, a lot of times an older demographic board member who really just wants 3 pages in front of them, 1 page being the budget. Does the money make sense? Is the need there? Do you align? Have you done it before? Are you going to be able to do what you say you're going to do? Do you have the buy-in from the necessary executives at your organization? If you're higher ed, is the provost on board if you're a faculty member? If your staff is your vice president of said department on board, again in higher ed, if you're a nonprofit organization, has your executive director signed off on the proposal? These are important. You as the grant writer, if you are not the executive director, you would never sign off on that. You want their signature. So private foundation and corporations typically want less information. Again, talked about their shorter proposals than do government agencies. Another trick of the trade down here, the common grant application, I've never used, but again, if you're a novice, this is your first time, you just want some type of rubric, some type of outline, some type of framework. This isn't a bad thing to print off and kind of let it guide you through what you would include within a proposal. Because sometimes you'll target one of these private family foundations and their guidelines, criteria, and instructions for application are more than broad. They're just 3 bullet points, really don't tell you anything. You've looked at their 990. They've awarded what you think are organizations that are like-minded as yourself, and you've done your due diligence in trying to steward a relationship, and you just need something to tell you what to include. This is not a bad resource. Again, that's the common grant application. and that's from the National Network of Grant Makers. And so, and then I included there at the end, when in doubt, call and ask. Never hurts. Best practices, I always call. I always call. You'll usually get some type of administrative assistant. Have your questions ready. They'll be happy to answer your questions. Ask if your letter of inquiry is appropriate to submit. And they'll tell you yes or no. And that will save you so much time.
So, hey, Daniel.
Go
hi.
ahead.
Bailey. Maybe you'll get into this, but since we're on this, on the writing of a proposal, at what point if let's say you've written a proposal, etc., and at what point do you, I mean, perhaps you have some peer help, you review it, but at what point do you can you gauge that the proposal has failed in terms of how it's structured and written, and really needs some type of reworking? But let's say if you don't have any peers to review it.
Right. So you're a little on your own. You've written your proposal. Now, I'm going based off this hypothetical. Have you had contact with the funder?
Oh, actually, I should explain. My background on this is I just saw this as a kind of an interesting seminar I can listen to and perhaps learn. And it's not a skill I particularly need yet. In fact, I actually sit on grants committees where I approve of grants for a nonprofit. But I just thought this is this could be a good skill for me to learn. That's all.
Right. And so it's just the inverse, right? And
but I have actually seen grants which are so wordy, I have no patience in reading it.
Right. And so there's your rubric right there. Again, I use the job application analogy. It's, have you ever hired someone versus have you applied for a job? And through either experience, you pretty much learn what the requirements are or what's going to make or break you in either setting. And so you, as someone who has reviewed grants, you kind of have a gist of, based on the organization that I served on in reviewing grants, I know through my own experience what I do or don't have the patience for, what others that I have worked with, what their patience was in terms of reviewing grants. Especially in that private sector. I'm assuming you're talking about the private sector. They're really not, as you highlighted, they're really not these exhaustive
10-page
just burdens of proof to get money. Depending on the project, I wouldn't submit more than 5 pages, especially to a private organization, unless they specified otherwise, right? And so you should be able to get your purpose, your need statement, your budget, and all that in there, and validate what it is you're trying to submit for. And so, no, I appreciate the question, and that is in terms of knowing if you're out there and you're on your own, knowing whether or not your proposal is going to make or break. Do your research and what they have awarded in the past. So that's when we talk about what could have seemed awkward in some of those previous bullet points that really speak to talk to others, talk to your peers. If you see someone on that 990 that has been awarded by the organization that you're targeting, reach out to them and see if they'll talk to you in terms of how and why they were successful. What did they learn in terms of the temperament of that organization? It doesn't hurt. It's common practice. If people get a little, they feel a little proprietary and they don't want to share with you what they feel is their tricks of the trade, then so be it. You move on and you try to figure out other ways. But you should know any more organizations set up their criteria to eliminate any apprehension and you either providing too much or too less. They're pretty specific these days in what they expect. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see here. So again, major components of the proposals. This kind of goes into public agencies. So they seldom expect proposals to be as short. So what we were just talking about, as short as private foundations or corporations. The public agencies are more demanding. The problem with public agencies, you are going to hit about 10 pages plus with them. And there's massive back end reporting. Let's say you're rewarded from the public/federal agencies. They need the data that you're going to generate off them giving, because that's what nonprofits are, right? They're the third sector. You have the for-profit sector, you have federal, state, so government, and then you have nonprofits. Nonprofits are that stopgap in between. They are providing that public need that the for-profit's not providing, and that the government can or just doesn't have the capacity to provide to the public. And so in comes nonprofits, governments develop grants to subsidize, nonprofit fills that implementation role. They need that data back in terms of validating what they did with those taxpayers' money. So just keep that in mind when targeting federal resources. It's not a yes or no or an absolute in terms of the route you should take. I just really caution people to keep that in mind. There's typically can be a lot more work when it comes to federal, but federal's grants tend to be of more funding, you know, your 7 to 8 figure grants. And so examples of proposal content. So we talk about the purpose. What do we want to do? To what end? That's important. The need. Why do this? Procedures. So objectives, in other words, how will we do it? The evaluation. How will we know if it worked? The qualifications. Why choose us? Validate yourself. And then budget. I can't stress budget enough. People really don't mail it in on your budget. Let's say if you're going towards the private organizations, you'll have some of these board members, that's all they'll look at. It's the budget, the need, and the purpose, and whether or not you have the capacity to carry it out. The numbers tell it all. And so we talk about the title page. Title page, I wouldn't get bogged down in this. It's you can include it, you cannot include it. I wouldn't get too worried about a title page. I'm not going to spend much time on that. I talk about signage assurances. Really have those high-ranking officials sign off on that. As a grant writer, especially for Lyon College, I never signed off on an LOI or a grant proposal. It was always the provost. It was always the president. It was always my VPA, my vice president for advancement. I was essentially a ghostwriter. So we coming into this kind of, this is about the beginning. We talk about our abstract, typically half a page. It is a self-contained, ready for publication description of the project. Really, in grant writing, I wouldn't go as far as call it technical writing, but it is very intentional, direct, and succinct writing. No passive voice. Get to the point. If you have fluff, what I call fluff, flowery writing, take it out. They're reading hundreds of these applications that, as Maylee said, they don't have time for it. So be very intentional in your writing, covering purpose, outcomes, objectives. Again, the abstract, we're introducing that need, significance, procedures, things of that nature. They should stress the end products and benefits of the project. Again, 200 to 250 words. This is a skill to get all of that into 250 words. It's why there are grant writing professionals. It is a skill, and it will be used verbatim by the program manager. Think of it like your elevator pitch. And so we come to our statement of purpose, a little bit longer, that roughly, these are approximates. I wouldn't live or die by these estimates. About a page and a half. It is a specific description of the expected outcomes, goals, and objectives. I should have reversed that. It's goals, objectives, outcomes. That's your formula. Goals, so goal, the what, the how you're going to do it, and the outcomes. Outcomes are tangible. Outcomes are measurable. Outcomes are numbers. Goal is a very broad statement. We want to help youth. Outcomes. We will help 50% of at-risk youth within said county to increase their test scores by 20%, right? Short, broad statement, detailed, countable, tangible statement. And then, I'm sorry, that's goals is the short, broad statement. And objectives is your how-to. You show you have thought, planned out, and really have assessed how you're going to get said outcomes to achieve this project. Again, this section is usually quite detailed. I don't have too many bullet points here, but very important section, statement of purpose. Need statement can make or break you. Well-documented description of the problem to be addressed and why it's important. Again, as I said in the beginning, do not write from the aspect of your organization needing to help people. Write from those that you are seeking to benefit needs. Speak from them, for them. Do not write on behalf of yourself. It will really help set the tone and voice of your proposal. It should establish significance, timeliness, and contribution to other work. Credible sources should be used for all statistics, of course, supporting and explaining needs. That should go left unsaid. Anytime you need to validate your statistics, where you get them from, how you got them, that sort of thing. Procedures, so it's basically your plan of action for how the purposes will be achieved. Discuss how it's different or complementary to similar efforts by others. That can be depending upon, just because someone has done something within the realm that you're proposing to do, maybe you're building upon it and taking it to next levels. That can happen as well. It doesn't always have to be necessarily different. Stress collaborations. Collaborations can be very beneficial with other, especially if you're in a small community like Nantucket. I would say collaboration and partnerships can and should be used as much as possible. It really just builds upon capacity, and you'd be surprised at the good work you can get out of collaborations. Tell how the results will be disseminated to others. So that's just, funders are going to want to know, one, is your work scalable? And two, they're going to want to know the ROI on their funding. So they want to see that the benefit that came from their money, how is it going to reach the community's awareness? In other words, are you going to market said program? Is there going to be photo ops and that sort of thing? And that stuff's important. It may not seem important, but it is. Think of it as raising awareness to the accomplishments and the needs and the whys and the hows to your program. So sustainability, I haven't really talked about this much yet. I should talk about it more. Half a page, sustainability is really important. A lot of private organizations do not want their money to be the end all be all. They don't want the project to solely depend upon their funding. They don't want it to be the beginning and the only reason why the project begins, and they don't want it to, once it runs out, to be the end of the project. Think of it as a circle, and they want their money to be the link within that circle to keep it perpetually running as a sustainable project. So government funders want to know how these activities will be supported after the grant ends. Some agencies ask that this be discussed as part of the procedures. Others want it to be a separate component. Be specific about your plans for future funding, including other grantors, individual donors, and earned income. You'll find that a lot in your budget. You will most, whether it be federal, whether it be private, are going to want to see others that are invested within the project. And so typically that's reflected in the sustainability section and your budget. And so just keep that in mind. Having a solo grantor for a project or program is can be tricky, and a lot of times they do not like to see that. They like to see multiple avenues of funding come into that project. They don't want it to solely depend upon their money. Evaluations especially get important when you're dealing with that federal money like I talked about. So just going into evaluations, that details the means by which the applicant funding source will know that the project has accomplished, should describe the questions to be asked. So that gets into the M&E, what we mean by M&E, that's monitoring and evaluation. And there's all kinds of best practices when it comes to proper and appropriate monitoring evaluations. That's a whole sector within itself. There are evaluation specialists out there, and they are very important, and the government really employs a lot of them. Should describe the questions to be asked, the methods to be used in gathering and analyzing the data, and how the information will be used and reported. Again, many government sources are now requiring that this section be formatted as a logic model for outcome-based evaluation. If you're not used or have not done a proper evaluation logic model or any type of monitoring and evaluation, I would advise you to study up on that before you start writing a federal proposal. It can be very technical and lengthy, and again, if you've never done it, it can be a bit mind-boggling. You feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again, but you're not. If you are saying the same thing over and over again, you're doing it wrong. So just keep that in mind. So qualifications of personnel, the people involved from your organization, are they relevant? Are they qualified? Qualifications, duties, yeah, just make sure that those that you have listed that are going to be carrying out the project are qualified to do that. That's what those funders are going to be looking for. Budget, I do want to spend some time on this. Budgets are really important. So really hitting these bullet points. The cost of the project for each year of its operation should be displayed. Major line items. Itemize what is being provided by the sponsoring organization, what is being requested, if it's federal or government, and what will be contributed by other sources. That can be in kind, that can be other proposals that you're soliciting. What are those other proposals going to cover? There is increased interest among government sources in supporting projects that are also funded by private foundations. So you can you can look at that as a public-private collaboration there. So just kind of keep that in mind as a resource. And so we may also want to use footnotes or budget narrative. Yes, use a budget narrative to explain how various costs were computed. Do not just say, we need 10 tables. 10 tables cost $500. Explain how you got that $500. Include an extra column, if at the very least. Budget, any type of narrative within your budget's important. Coming back up top, a plan of action for every additional fundraising should be provided. Listen, again, the budget's so, like I said, especially in the private world, a budget can make or break you. They really want to see that you've accounted for any and all obstacles, pitfalls, shortcomings, unforeseens. The budget explains your project through numbers. Show relevance when I say us, to us as the organization and how we would approach, show ownership, maybe a committee, maybe a template that could represent, okay, that goes back to my past organization in terms of a patient registry. That was the project we were working on, was a patient registry. And so again, budget's really important. If you have any questions, do your research, find like-minded organizations' budgets. They're out there on the web. Yeah, more is important with budgets, I would say. Attachments, don't go crazy with attachments, especially in private. If they haven't asked for it, don't include it. They don't, again, they get bogged down with so many submittals that any extra stuff, they might just trash it. Nonprofits should attach their 501c3 letter unless told in the guidelines. Yeah, I wouldn't attach, that's not a necessary unless asked for. That can be more of legalities in terms of making sure their money is going to an appropriate place and kind of their back-end bookkeeping with that sort of stuff. All organizations should include the names and affiliations of their board. Yes, a lot of organizations are going to want to know that. That just shows, again, board member buy-in. Letters of supports or agreements. These bullets are really just, they're not absolutes in what you should attach. It's just they give examples of what you could see that could be requested to be attached. So letters of supports, any type of guidelines, board sign-offs, your EIN number, your 501c3 letter from the IRS validating that you are indeed a nonprofit organization by way of 501c3. And that stuff, some organizations want it, some don't mess with it. It just depends. Excuse me, Zoom. So, moving forward, developing templates. So what this is talking about is if you're with an organization and you're trying to ramp up your grant making efforts, we're talking about boilerplates. So come up with that title page to use every time, so you're not going to have to reinvent the wheel every time. Your abstract should be easy to do. Again, this is your organization, your mission statement, and things of that nature. You should be able to just go grab, cut, copy, and paste and keep it moving in terms of the abstract. Your statement of purpose, this is going to be more of an idea of singular project, multiple funders being solicited. Get that boilerplate hammered out, make sure it works for everybody, plan of action, so on and so forth. Boilerplates really cut your time down. The bigger your organization, the more likely you are to have these resources. I know working at Lyon, I definitely had a bunch of boilerplates ready to go. Because in the real world, you will get an RFP late with 2 weeks to go and you're scrambling, and boilerplates can cut your time in half. And so writing the proposal and submitting the proposal, keeping that timeline in terms of the proposal, I'm not going to get you bogged down in this too much. It's just make sure you've really identified some proposal applications can have deadlines before the final deadline. Just keep those in mind, make sure everybody's on board. Post-submission, it can take a bit of a turnaround to get an answer. Again, I was talking about that, keeping that return on investment with grants in mind. If you've got a program that needs to be funded yesterday, maybe grants aren't the appropriate avenue in which you need to be subsidizing said program. And so that's just keep timelines in terms of the proposal development in mind. Quick kind of chart breakdown what we've talked about in terms of months. So first month, identify your need, assess your capability, decide whether to proceed further. Again, what I just said, is it appropriate to pursue grants to fund said program. Second month, identify those involved, approach partners, conduct needs assessment. Third month, research potential funding sources, send LOIs. If need be, I have always sent LOIs. I like sending LOIs, especially to the private family organizations. But this should be way, way ahead of the game, LOIs. Because even LOIs, it's going to be involved months, especially with the turnaround on getting an answer of whether or not even to submit a proposal from said organization. But they are a good best practice. They really help with stewardship. Even if you don't end up submitting anything to them, LOIs can at least get you on that foundation's radar. So fourth month, final version of the project idea, need and approach, first draft of the proposal. Fifth month, complete version, fit in formats required by the funder. And then the 6th through 9th, kind of what we were talking about with the question earlier, initial review, request for additional information or clarification. 10th through 12th, so now we're getting into a year. This breakdown is, it's long. In the real world, I've never taken a year, so 12th month approval or rejection is received. A year is a long time. A year is more the situation to where you have, so you're at an organization, you have a private family foundation that you wish that your organization had a relationship. They give out money to a lot of like-minded organizations such as yourself, and you want to get on that list and their radar. When you go on their website, you quickly see unsolicited request not accepted. So great, what do you do then? And so that's when the LOI comes involved. That's when that stewardship from your executives get involved. And that's when you would really start seeing this yearly process get involved. Your solicited, your RFPs, those aren't going to take a year. I've had RFPs where my president of the college, his office, his administrative assistant comes to me, puts the announcement on my desk, and I got 2 weeks till deadline, go. So just keep that in mind. This just kind of breaks down, I would say, starting cold with a foundation and developing a relationship with them for a future project. That's what I would keep this in mind for in terms of that yearly process. Conclusion, just kind of recap the 2 phases. Essential planning steps, writing and submitting. Essential, identify your characteristics, assess, refine, select. Writing, identify, gather, and again, use a checklist so you don't leave anything out. And I know I flew through that. There's a lot to weed through. It can be a bit nuanced. The more, it's like anything, the more you do it, the more you kind of refine and develop your own approach to it. Again, there's no real playbook. There are best practices, but I would say more of guiding based on what not to do as opposed to what to do. I really appreciate you hanging out and stomaching the heavy text PowerPoint slides there. It was a lot of information I wanted to make sure that I got to you. I want to thank you all again for coming out. I'm at the Atheneum. Janet's at the Atheneum. Never hesitate to reach out to us. We're here. We're generating content on the daily, and any concerns, questions, things you'd want to pitch, don't hesitate. And thank you again.